Hello, and welcome to In the Know Women Show. My name is Darlene Adkins, and I'm your host today for our 14th episode. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Missy Widmann, Mary Snyder, and Tabitha Ellison from the nonprofit organization Neural Education. They train educators about the brain and how neuroscience supports student learning. It's a very special episode to me because as a kid, I had a lot of difficulty in school with focus, comprehension, and grades that set me back. In recent years, I've been on a campaign to incorporate neuroscience findings into school curriculums, which I think is key to student empowerment, efficacy, and success. To my surprise, I came across an organization located right here in Washington State that's already contributing to this endeavor. I'm relieved and very happy to know school children now and in the future will have better tools and confidence in their ability to learn. And when we come back, we'll talk with our guests about neural education and get to know them too. Okay, prepare your brain for engagement. Breathe. We'll see you after the opening. All right, well, welcome back, everybody, our audience and our guests. Thank you so much for making the time for In the Know Women Show. Very glad you're here today. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you so much. We're really glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, we're going to dive right in. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Widmann, or do you like to be called Missy?
You can call me Missy.
Okay. Missy, would you tell us what is neural education?
So neural education really came out of a connection of educators who wanted to make a change in education. And I guess I'll start telling a story about my niece that really kind of put me on this path. My niece she's an amazing human being, and she was struggling in school, and she got pushed out of the traditional model. And when it happened, I was so upset, and I thought, how do teachers not see her potential? She had so much potential, and there were some things that were happening in her lives that were outside of her control that were then being seen as unexpected behaviors in the classroom. So when I started really exploring the circumstance with her, I started realizing that the same things that teachers were doing in classrooms with her were the same punitive, progressive practices that I also was doing in my pedagogy in my classroom.
Wow.
And so I'm a health and fitness teacher. I've been teaching health and fitness for 25 years, and I really just started looking inward and looking at what are we doing in education that is setting students up for their trajectories in both education and professionally to meet their human potential. And it was in 2016 that I presented at a conference, and I was presenting brain breaks because I'm a health and fitness teacher, and I went and I presented brain breaks at this conference, and I presented. We had a ton of people come, like we had 40 chairs, and we had over 100 people come in and come to this event, and I thought, we were at a technology conference, so I thought, why are they here? Like we're there because we got accepted to go. And then we had all these people, and I didn't really understand. And we were talking about brain breaks, and we were talking about the impact of brain breaks on the brain and learning. Well, the next day I went to a conference, or I went to a session from Dr. Omani, who is my co-founder of Neural Education, and that was the day that it all clicked. And I went, oh my gosh, it's brain, and those are the things that we need to take into account in our classrooms. So what we do at Neural Education is we connect to the neuroscience with teaching and learning in our classrooms so that we can support our students in meeting their potential. We had our first institute at Pacific Lutheran University. We partnered with the kinesiology department there and Dr. Terry Farrar. And Mary and Tabitha came to our first ever institute, and it was a free event. Like, we were begging people to come. We had 25 educators that showed up, and we have been co-creating neural education ever since. And the thing that's really remarkable about these two women is that we all have different backgrounds in education, and so we have all these specialties, and when we come together, there's really this magic, this collective efficacy that builds when we do the work together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, Mary, why don't you share with us what you do with neuroeducation, and maybe talk a little bit about your background that led you to neuroeducation and the impact it's having on you.
Absolutely. So when I started connecting with Missy, it was at that conference that she's describing, and we just happened to, Tabitha and I were attending together, and we happened to go to one of Missy's sessions that she was facilitating, and also we were really heavily involved in social media, so we were tweeting at each other, and as we sat next to each other in the next session, we realized we should be connecting in real life, not just in social media. And so that's where she invited us to their first institute. And Tabitha and I were already collaborating as educators because I was working at that time coaching other teachers and instructional coaching. And most of the work that I was doing was in the general education classrooms, and Tabitha was working in special education classrooms. And so we were really interested to see how we could make sense of the neuroscience in both of these contexts. And so we were talking a lot with each other, we were talking a lot with Missy, and really trying to learn more and then implement some of the things that we were learning and just continue sharing with other educators. And so that's what we do now. I support a lot of the programming, and so developing and facilitating the professional learning that we offer. And so that's my major role with the
All right. Well, I'm glad you could come today too.
Thank you.
All right. And how about you, Tabitha?
Well, I definitely relate to your experience going to school. I had a similar experience, and I never thought I'd be in school again once I didn't have to be anymore. And so when I found myself as a paraeducator, that was surprising. And then I talked myself into going back to school, which I thought wasn't something I'd be able to do, and became a teacher, a special education teacher. And trying to figure out how to help students in a way that I felt like I never really had access to, and helping them to have access to their education is what really caused neuroeducation to really inspire me in the work that I did with kids.
Yeah, gosh. I'm so happy, so relieved that you all are out there doing this. And I will just tell you, the reason I discovered you all, and it feels a little bit like magic, or it's worth efforts, sometimes, as I was sitting on the couch wondering, how can we be more proactive in addressing the difficulty in society? That was kind of the question. And I thought, well, of course you teach kids when they're young, but teach them what? And I have just become such a huge fan of, all the folks out there who are making neuroscience now accessible to people, and it's not so much like rocket science anymore. And I thought, well, what if kids learned about their brain? How would that make a difference? And I pondered it, and it wouldn't leave me alone. And so I finally went over to the computer, and I thought, is anybody out there thinking this way? And that started my journey. And sure enough, I saw these names, and I saw these schools, and before you know it, I had a list, and then I would extract, out of their mission statement or their website, something about, that really hooked me about why learning about the brain is important for children. And I eventually put those lists together, and I started, off to the school board meetings, and that is where I serendipitously, I think, heard about neuroeducation. And it's so funny because the school board member I also wanted to present this to was absent and was not there that night, and she usually always is. But as I was leaving, there she was at the door, and she says, I was running a little bit late, I've been out here, and she took a look at my paperwork, and she says, what's this, neuroscience of learning? I'm like, yeah, I believe children should know. And she says, well, there's this organization, and they have workshops, and you should check them out. So that's what I did. And so I discovered you all. So it's great. It's great that the world is small enough, and we have these trainings, these people that are in the know about this in the state of Washington. And we might get into talking about those other folks that you're collaborating with a little later in the interview. But what I want to go back to you, Missy, and ask, why is neural education so critically important at this time?
That is such a great question. And there's this saying, kids these days, and we say it over and over again. And what we realize is this is something we've all been saying forever. In fact, even Socrates said it at one point, right? And so when we really look at kids these days, oftentimes what will happen is we might say, oh, that kid can't sit, that kid can't listen, that kid can't focus. And when we go into this space of this kid can't, then it stops us. And then we are not able to support a student in their learning. But when we start getting curious about, this kid, I'm noticing these unexpected behaviors in my class. When we start getting curious, then we could shift our practice and meet the needs of that individual student. With that being said, there is some research on brains that is really interesting that we actually went to the Learning in the Brain conference, and Dr. Ian Gottlieb from Stanford was presenting the post-COVID brain, which was really interesting. So we went to the session, and he really, I'll explain the longitudinal study that he was doing, and then it'll make sense. But he was doing a longitudinal study on if we could determine a key signature in the brain of a 14-year-old versus a 15-year-old, 16, 17, and so forth. And so he was taking pictures, fMRI pictures of brains, and so he was doing it, the kid's 13, take a picture of the brain. They're 14, take a picture of their brain, and so forth, and he was gonna have it go all the way through their teens. Well, then, obviously, we had a global pandemic, and it shut down his study. So his team, they decided, what if we looked and determined if there's a key signature in the post-COVID brain? So they did a study looking specifically at the 15-year-old brain. And in his presentation, and you can read the research, it's really talking about the aging brain process that happened. But in his presentation to us at this conference, he said there were 2 key signatures in the post-COVID brain of the 15-year-olds that he was looking at. And he said the first one was thinning cortices, which we as neural educators understand that the cortices is where the executive functioning happens. It's where the 21st century skills of collaboration and creativity occur, critical thinking. And he also noticed in it that there were thinning cortices and larger amygdalae. And we, as neural educators, understand that larger amygdalae mean that there is a more reactive stress response that is going to happen. So it's really interesting research, and we can look at it and we can get curious. And then when we say things like, oh, this kid, or kids these days, then we can get curious. And what we love about Dr. Ian Gottlieb's research is that in his research, he says that luckily we know about plasticity, and brains change over time. And even the impact of a global pandemic, that doesn't mean that that's a fixed brain state. That we're always myelinating something, we're always growing neural connections in students' brains, and we need to think, are we myelinating and growing their amygdalae, or are we myelinating and growing their prefrontal cortex? So
now, maybe we should stop and, what is myelinating? I've never used that in a sentence before. My brain is intrigued.
So actually, myelination is basically like the wire. So you see wires around, and there's like the coating on a wire. That's basically what the brain is like, or a neuron in the brain is like. So there's this coating, and that coating, as you get more and more coating on the axon of a neuron, then that's what learning is. So for example, we say, you never forget to ride a bike, how to ride a bike. And that's because you have such a deeply myelinated pathway in your brain that when, 10 years goes by, you don't get on a bike, but then you're able to get on a bike and remember how things things work.
So some of those old sayings that they use are still valid.
Yeah.
They're valid.
Yeah.
Even with the new neuroscience, they still stand up to the test of time. Like, get back up there on the bike, or what is the cliche? Anyone? You fall off the bike, you get back on, something like that.
I think what makes that kind of that meaningful is that now we understand the why. So that old-timey kind of saying, like you don't forget how to ride a bike. Now, as neuroeducators, we understand why you don't forget. And that why of understanding myelination, now we can take that understanding and apply it to a student's learning around social studies or math practice or reading, right? And so we can understand how the brain myelinates the neural pathway for riding a bike. We can use that to help us myelinate the neural pathways for the 21st century skills and thinking that Missy was talking about. So we want students to be able to collaborate and learn from each other. Then we need to myelinate the pathways for collaboration. And so kind of making those analogies to something we already accept can help us now apply. That's what we call applying our neural lens to teaching and learning.
Maybe this is a good time to kind of shift into, how do you teach the teachers? And I think we can bring up specific trainings now, or we can talk a little bit more about it later on at the closing of the show, what's upcoming over the summer, however you'd like to do that. But can you give examples of how teachers are taught?
Sure.
And how it would look to teaching a student as well. Can you do that?
Sure. Well, Missy mentioned the first Summer Institute that they hosted in 2017. Tabitha and I participated in that as learners. And then that has been the major sort of cornerstone for neural education training, has been the Summer Institutes. Because that makes sense, because that's when teachers have time, right, to continue and invest in themselves, continue learning. And so from 2017, the offerings of Summer Institutes have expanded. And we think of 2020 as being a really pivotal year because, of course, we had, like everyone else, to shift from in-person to online learning. And we were able to do that really successfully. And in fact, that summer, I think we had 4 virtual institutes. Wow. And so that was a really big feat of collaboration and creativity. And so from there, so I would say the Summer Institutes, now we're expanding to have institutes at other times of the year as well. And we also offer book studies. So we do virtual book studies with educators. We offer other shorter term training. So our institutes now are typically 3 days, but we also offer shorter trainings. And now many school districts are contracting directly with neural education to come into a school or into a school district and offer the training there on their campuses. And that's just increased access quite a bit for educators, obviously, to get the training in their job space and in their schools.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. I'm great that it's so accessible, or has become so accessible. Are there examples that you could give, or does it take too long, or can you, could you talk about that?
We do.
I would just want to add about going online. That was really huge. As difficult as it was to have to pivot to going online, it's made our outreach much bigger because people from other countries come, people from all over the states come rather than just in Washington. Yeah. And then also there's that Zoom fatigue, and after teaching online, teachers were like, I can't take a 5-day class on Zoom, like no way. But actually, we got a lot of feedback about being energized and feeling refreshed, and like also helping them know how they could do it in a way that would be more accessible and less exhausting, because that is, it's not a good time usually, but it was a good time. We made Zoom a good time. And so I think that us being able to take that neuroscience and apply it to teaching it online was a really huge deal. Yeah. And one example I would say of teaching teachers going back to myelination and how we can use that to help teachers understand how to teach different academics and things like that. a huge thing is we have an understanding. If we take that and we look at some of the behaviors we see in the classroom, or back to what Missy said about her niece, and being able to understand that also our stress response is a myelinated pathway. And so what do we do about that? And so teaching teachers that, I think, has been the biggest impact, probably, because, you know, teachers know how to teach their kids, but then they're like, but then these different things get in the way, and helping them understand it's not the kid getting in the way, and things that we can do in the environment so that we can create a structured, different environment that helps create the structures in their brain, that we can myelinate a different response to stress. And even though that other one stays there because of the myelination, we can make the new myelinated response that's safe to be the more automatic response for that student. And educators learn they can do that for themselves as well, because we have our own stress response that's going to get us away from doing the good teaching and the good connecting with kids that we know that we can do.
Yeah, I would imagine that it would just be such a relief to have an explanation of what's going on, you know, and then you know, I know all teachers, you know, want to love their kids, and they want to be patient with their kids, and they don't want frustration. They want to be able to teach, and I just feel like that would be sort of liberating, that little stress part, to say, aha, now I get it. And I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, and now I understand sort of what's happening in the background here.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, and just having like a new new lease on patience. You know, you didn't think you could give any more, and now you do, because you know it's sort of out of the kid's control.
And it's hard to have patience if you don't know what to do. But once you know what to do, you can have the patience because you know how to help, you know how to move it forward. It's very frustrating, and it causes your own amygdala hijack when you feel helpless in the situation and you're not sure how to help the child or help yourself.
Can we use this wonderful looking brain right here on the table? I don't know if we can, yeah, we got a shot of that. I'm going to try to point to some areas, maybe.
Pop quiz.
Pop quiz. You all help me out here. Now, I think, here we go with, this is the prefrontal cortex, right? Up in this area, okay. And I'm going to go back to this little ornery place in the brain called the amygdala. Is that back in here somewhere?
So the amygdala, there's two of them, and they're on either side of the brain. And so they're just right in here in the limbic system. And so you have one on the right and one on the left, and they're literally about the size of an almond, the shape of an almond.
That's an ornery place in the brain, isn't it, that amygdala?
I mean, the amygdala is a beautiful thing. If we didn't have the amygdala, then we wouldn't have fear that actually keeps us safe.
Yeah.
So there is like this, it's really a switching station. It's not fear itself, but basically it's a switching station that basically says, is this safe, is this not safe? And if it's safe, we can go into our prefrontal cortex then. If it's not safe, then it brings us back into the lower part of our brain that's reactive and oftentimes involuntary.
I see. Should we stay right here and discuss a little more of the brain, or maybe what kids learn in these, whatever the teachers are learning in the workshop, and then how it gets applied to the children? Can we stay right here and do that?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because we have really started diving into open education resources, which are resources for educators that are free, that then they can download and change up and fit the needs of their individual students. And we really started doing it because educators were coming to our sessions, and we were using Realia, for example. We have oranges that we use to be a mental model for a brain. And so we have these things that we bring in, and then the educators were like, I want to do this exact lesson with my students. And so we've been started to do these open education resources, but what's happening is educators are actually really good at educating, and they are taking these things and they're making so much more out of them. In fact, there's one educator that I've been working with who now she's creating videos with students, teaching the brain to teachers, which is just like, we would have never, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
And then these educators are taking the work that we're doing in the these experiential opportunities that we're doing in our professional learning opportunities with educators, and they're bringing them into their classroom in just such remarkable ways.
Yeah. And why couldn't children learn about the brain? It's not impossible. They're little sponges, right? And that's what I found in my research, looking at who is out there who's advocating for children to learn about their brain. And that's what they're saying is it's not something a child cannot learn and understand with age-appropriate lessons. And I found a couple different places where they had lessons already for preschool and up through elementary and then on into the higher grades.
I was actually going to mention that, Darlene, because oftentimes in our professional learning spaces, teachers will say, okay, that sounds great for a high school classroom, or that sounds like it'll work really well with middle school kids. I teach kindergarten. What can I do? Or I teach special education. How can I bring this to my students? And some of our favorite examples come from the kindergarten classroom, or come from these places where there was maybe a question at first. And we love to share and see the videos that our neural educators are posting of them sharing the neuroscience with with our youngest learners, and how then the students themselves will talk about their myelinated pathways, or that they want to practice something so that it becomes more automatic and their brain becomes more flexible. And they'll use the neuroscience terminology. And so it's very exciting when you see that happen. It definitely is possible.
Yeah, I just marvel at the idea of, our kids now and in the future will be sort of masters of their brain, and when they're 18, they really hit the ground running as adults, if not before, of just, kind of understanding what the amygdala does and when it's hijacked, and how they can better cope with things, regardless if there's a teacher, a parent, or, some good person in their life. Like, they can fall back on this knowledge that they've learned all the way from preschool on up. It's like second nature. I hope that's the way we see it in the future. So they're much more empowered, and some parents will like to hear this. They have much more self-responsibility. I just see so many applications of children who are well aware of what's going on in their brain and what to do when trouble arises. That they're independent and hopefully they function well, better than what we see maybe going on today or post-COVID.
We see that especially the students have that more automatic stress response and have it more often. Teaching them about the brain and that it happens to everyone is such a huge stress reliever. And that right there can kind of bring that threat response being so automatic down when they realize nothing is wrong with them, which is what they thought, but that it's how our brain works, and this is how your brain works, and we can actually practice some different responses if you would like to, if you're interested. And they're always interested in doing that. And that itself, just learning that alone, just makes a huge, huge difference for a lot of kids.
Yeah. I can feel that. I feel like I learned that at like 26, not 16 or 6. Right. I wish it was much earlier.
If I might add just one more thing, Darlene, I think one of the things that we have found it so powerful in what educators reply back to us is that when they learn about the brain and they are learning the neuroscience of emotion and the connection of emotion to the cognitive spaces, right, that they're really focused on, I think the neuroscience isn't a subject. So they don't have just a subject of neuroscience. So they think, how can I bring this into my classroom? I have to do all these other things. But once they understand the interconnectedness of emotion and relationship and regulation with the cognitive functioning of their brains, of students' brains, then teachers find the importance of teaching this really supports the students' engagement in learning the content that is so important and is the goal of the school day. And so it becomes, what Tabitha was talking about, very empowering, because now we do have the skills, we do have the knowledge to help our students understand how emotion is impacting their learning, and then to change or to make steps towards the changes that they want for themselves, and how important that can be for teachers and students.
And that comes back to human potential, and bringing it back to my niece. My niece graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing, and she put dropout to BSN on her cap. And during COVID, she was one of the nurses that were in the ICU every day. And I think about the impact that she's had on our world now, and if she didn't get that opportunity, then she's saving lives every day. And there's so many of our students who have so much potential. And if we don't do something really intentional to build structures and supports in our classrooms that meet their needs, we're going to miss out on their potential.
Yeah, and I feel very, very grateful that I was in a different atmosphere in my 20s where people believed in me, and that made a difference. I think my brain was rewired when I was in a community where people believed in your potential, supported you in your endeavors, even had some fun with learning. That changed me, and I keep trying to to pay that forward in the work I do in my volunteer efforts. But I know we're coming to the end here, and they're telling me, they're giving me the signal to wrap it up here.
We're really excited to partner with ESD 113, and we have a Neuroscience of SEL and Resilience on August 8th, 9th, and 10th. So we're excited about that in the Tumwater area. And then we also have our Neuroscience of Attention at PLU on July 23rd through the 25th in the summer. And we also have Neuroscience of Equity, which is 2025, but it's February 30th through January 30th through February 1st. So we have lots of offerings coming, and we want to invite anybody who cares about kids to attend.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Missy Widmann and Mary Snyder and Tabitha Ellison, for taking the time to be with us and sharing, this great news about what we know about the brain and how it's impacting, our future society, our children, and the teachers who teach. So thank you for all your good work. I very much appreciate what you do and make the time for us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.